Hello everyone and welcome. This is my first video, and to start out this little series I had in mind, I wanted to analyze and to talk about Sicut Cervus by Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. Now, anyone who's sung in a choir probably has come across this piece and has sung it at least once. At least people who have sung in choirs that sing early music, because this is one of the most famous pieces of choral music ever written, and with reason. So I'm happy to be talking about it today. Now, before we begin, I'd like to say that I'm going to be as simple as possible with the terminology here, because I'd like this video to be accessible to as many people as possible, even amateur choral singers who are interested in digging deeper into the pieces they sing. Now, for example, it's not really correct to talk about F major as the original pitch of this piece. But bear with me if I use these kind of terms, because modern terminology is what we use today, and it's what I'm going to use to explain this piece. I would, if I wanted to be really strict about things, I'd have to talk about hexachords, modes, cantus mollis, and so on. But I'm not going to be too strict with the terminology I use here. So let's say the original pitch of this piece is F major, and most modern choirs are going to transpose it up a third, major or minor. So it's going to be in A flat major or A major, the actual performance key. I'm going to look at the original score just for because that's how it was written, and I'd like to analyze the way Palestrina uses melody and harmony to depict the text. So my analysis is going to be really focused on the expressiveness that Palestrina is looking for when writing this piece. Now, the reason it would be transposed up and is for the altos not to be too low and for the tenors not to be too high. I mean, it's a compromise. The altos are still going to be pretty low in some points, because this piece was conceived for male voices. So the alto line would have been sung by a modern day tenor, let's say. And the highest line, the cantus, the soprano line, would have been sung by a group of children. So that's the reason that the piece has to be transposed by a choral conductor, and for it to be performable by a modern day choir. Another mistake I'm going to make right away, and I'm going to announce it, is talk about bars. Now, bars did not exist at the time, but for commodity's sake, I have here a score, and it has bars have been added into it. At the time, singers would have their own line without bars, but only their own line, not the full score, and they would be looking at the notes one after the other and following the beat, which usually is described as the speed of the beat is usually described as the beating of the heart. So it would be pretty much 1 beat per second, and the beat corresponds to a semibreve usually. This depends on several indicators, but right now we're not going to get too philological about it, and we're just going to talk about bars. So with these premises out of the way, I hope you're going to bear with me if I'm not 100% correct in what I say, in the terminology I use at least. We're going to be looking at bars 1 to 24. So the text, I'd like to say a few words about the text. It's sacred, and basically the meaning of the text is, as a deer desires the source of water, so does my spirit desire you, O God. So this beautiful metaphor, and it's wonderfully depicted by Palestrina musically. So we're looking at the first bars, so bars 1 to 24, and it's talking about the deer desiring the source of water, so thirsting for the water, and the very first phrase, so the subject of the piece, the theme, the melody on which the piece is based on, is sung by the tenor. So we have the tenor singing Sicut Cervus desiderat ad fontes aquarum. So the first three notes of this melody, the first four notes, Sicut Cervus, are pretty much just descriptive. So it stays on Fa and then goes up to a Sol and then back to a Fa. So there's not much movement there. It's just saying like a deer. So it's like an introduction, sort of, to the text. And it's interesting to see how the rhythm really characterizes this entry. Every voice is going to sing this melody, and the start is going to be very easy to recognize, both for the words and the notes used. So it's just two notes, but with a certain rhythm. Then it goes on to say desiderat. Desiderat means to want, to desire, to need something, and you really get that sense of desire, of need, from these four ascending notes. Desiderat. So it's really something that you're seeking for. So I mean, I really don't think that these things are casual, or I think Palestrina really thought about it when composing this melody. About how to describe the feelings that these words express. Now, another interesting thing is that when the words say fontes, it's the highest peak up to that point, and then it goes back down. So it's the highest note of that ascending phrase, and then it goes back to an A and an F. I think that's interesting, because the source of water is going to be high up in a mountain, right? So I mean, I'm just speculating here, but the fontes, the source of water, is high up, and it's on the highest note of that in that moment. So anyway, then it goes on to aquarum, and that's the only part in which there is not one syllable for every note. So there's a melisma on aquarum, and that's rather obviously describing the flow of a body of water, because there has not been a melisma up to that point, and the choice to place a melisma right on aquarum is a blatant sort of madrigalism. So from a contrapuntal point of view, all of the voices obviously sing the melody. The only voice that sings something different is the alto, because it's actually singing the same exact melody, but it's singing it up a fifth above. We're talking about a canon here as a musical form, when every voice sings the same melody, but not at the same time, obviously. So the alto simply starts on a C instead of starting on an F. Now, the interesting thing is when the voices enter. So the alto enters after 4 beats of pause. The soprano enters 3 beats after that. And the bass enters 4 beats after that. So that's there's an interesting asymmetry to the entries. This is, I think, the reason is that one, for harmonic purposes, I mean, the harmonies that are formed work out this way. The piece was conceived this way. But for instance, it's interesting to see that the bass line enters exactly when the tenor line hits its last note. That's interesting because it gives the music a certain flow. I mean, what we're talking about is a desire for water, So we're describing something that flows beautifully and with, it just has a smooth, calm mood to it. So the bass enters at bar 6, at the second beat of bar 6, when effectively there is a cadence on F major there. So where the other voices end and seem to, cadence, the bass enters and starts something completely new. So it keeps the music going, and this really works well. I mean, from both from a harmonic point of view and an expressive point of view, because although it is a cadence, it doesn't feel like a cadence because you can really hear the basses enter and that they have to, sing the rest of the melody. So it doesn't feel in the least like the music is stopping there. So basically this entire section has the voices singing the melody one after the other. The only thing that changes is the last part of the melody. Every time there's a quorum, there's a different kind of melisma there. So that's the part that changes in every voice. For example, at bar 8, the alto has that lovely melisma with do, re, mi, fa, and then it ends on a mi. The soprano after that on bar 9 has a series of notes on the syllable qua of aquarum, and then it repeats aquarum with a different kind of melisma. And Palestrina really lets loose his creative talent there on that melisma and really gives the sense of flowing water. On bar 13, the tenors start with a melisma, and it goes on up to the end of bar 18, sorry. I mean, halfway through bar 18, I'm sorry about that. So basically the entire section has every voice singing the melody at a different time, and that's all of the entries have the melody or a part of the melody. I see that only towards the end do the entries change on the desiderat. So there's different kind of notes on the desiderat at bars 18 in the basses, for instance, and in the altos. But I mean, in that place, it's more of a harmonic role, because what's really leading there is the melody in the sopranos. On bar 18, desiderat ad fontes, and the sopranos are singing that. So the rest of the voices are pretty much just supporting that melody, and then the sopranos go away with it with a lovely melisma at the end, up to bar 24. So that's the first episode. From a contrapuntal point of view, it's pretty simple and to look at. I mean, it must not have been simple to compose, because making a whole section work with one melody is not easy. But that's what this first section is built on. Now, in this first section, what we can also see is that Palestrina has a really deep respect for the words of a sacred text, and depicting them and making sure that they are clearly enunciated. I mean, every single strong syllable is infatuated in some way. It either has a higher note respect to the rest of the word, or it has a longer note. For example, the word cervus is on a sol, when the word sicut is on a fa, and cer is emphasized because it has a higher note than vus, and it has a longer note than vus. So the words are really wonderfully respected in their strong syllables, and that's something that really characterizes the music of this period, because of the reform that was going on at the time, where the church wanted the words to be clearly heard by the people, and what happens in polyphony sometimes in counterpoint is that you really can't understand the text, but this really doesn't happen in Palestrina because he's very careful to make things as clear as possible and as well written as possible. You sometimes see in obviously Palestrina had a familiarity on Latin pronunciation, living in Italy. You see sometimes some French composers when composing in Latin, they completely change the accents and put the emphasis on the last note, because that's just in the nature of the French language. I think an interesting thing is that the words are so clearly and wonderfully respected in this piece, and pretty much in all of Palestrina's music this happens. Now, in relation to this, it's interesting to point out that at the time the syllables were not placed underneath the notes. So sometimes it's not very clear where to put the words, because the phrase is written at the start, the words, the text that is put to music, and the music follows, but there's no correspondence to where the words are written and where they are to be sung. The singer has to understand where to put every syllable. Now, in some cases, this is pretty much very clear, because there's no other way to say the words in a way to make them fit, especially when there's one syllable to every word. But when there's long melismas, it can be kind of difficult to understand where to put every word. Now it's up to the singer to understand when the words are wrongly placed, meaning that sometimes there are some editions, especially those that are not that are made by amateurs or posted online, where the words are not correctly placed under the syllables, the syllables are not correctly placed under the music. So the singer has to be aware of this. The conductor has to be aware of this, and correct it when there's something that goes against the nature of the syllables, the words. Now we come to the next section. Now, there's no clear division between each episode here. I pointed out bar 24 because it's the end of the melisma on the alto line. But the interesting thing is that the sections just flow one into the other. It's just in the nature of this piece, in the mood of this piece, never to stop the flow of sound. And bar 24. Actually, on bar 23, what happens is that there's a cadence, but the altos just keep going with the melisma. The water just keeps flowing, And at the same time, the basses and the tenors almost simultaneously begin the next section with the next melody that is used. So we have the basses singing here. And so on, and the tenors the same melody but at the fifth, etc. So this is the next melody that is used here, and every voice comes in. So at bar 26 you can see the sopranos, and at bar 28 you can see the altos enter, again on different notes. So there's transpositions of the melody, but the melody is always one descending breve into a semi-breve, to say ita. Here we're talking about the human part, so of the melody. So does my spirit desire. Actually, so does its desire, and then the spirit is the construction of the phrase is a little different in Latin. So the spirit, the word spirit comes afterwards in the next section. So we're talking about the desire of the spirit, but there's not the word spirit yet. And here there's much more melismas, because on the word desire trying to give a sense of want, something that keeps going and searches for something. I mean, this is pretty clear. From bar 25 onwards, you can see that almost every syllable of desiderat is used to make a melisma. Is sung on more notes, every syllable. This doesn't happen on bar 27, 28, 29, on bar 30, where the tenors enter with ita desiderat and saying one word per note, one syllable per note. That gives kind of a sense of rest to the music, but basically it just keeps going because the altos don't stop. There's not really there's not a real cadence there. It's almost like an attempt to give the music some rest from the counterpoint. And the tenors seem to do this on bar 35 as well, where they enter with a syllabic enunciation of the words, so not with the usual melisma. So I mean, in this section, the tenors are pretty important in these entries because it's an element of difference and rest compared to the other voices. I mean, they have a different role, and I think that's pretty interesting. The use of the tenor line here in this section. It has these minims that come in and out now and then. And when you're singing it, it's something that comes out rather naturally. I mean, it's really heard from the midst of counterpoint of the whole choir, and it's an effect that I think that Palestrina was looking after, wanted to achieve. This happens sometimes. There's different ways to make voices come out. And this is one of the ways when other voices are singing on a single syllable and having a melismic line. When one of the other voices enunciates every syllable on a single note, that voice really comes out. It's sort of like a choral orchestration technique where you're able to point out a single voice, even though it's not singing in the highest register, or because when a voice is higher up compared to the others, depending on the register, it tends to come out more easily. That's something that we're going to see later on in the next section. But in this section, let's say up to bar 40 and on 41, 42. Because the basses end last on the desiderat. This goes on. This happens in the tenor line only. So that's pretty interesting. Another pretty interesting thing about this section is that on bar 27 there's a B natural in the tenors. So basically, there's a cadence in C, and that hasn't happened yet in the piece. So I mean, it gives a sense of the music going somewhere else. It's not a modulation because again, tonality was not yet invented. So it's just a cadence on a different tone than F, and this gives a new sense to the music, a new flow, a new sound, a kind of harder sound to the music, because it's not an F anymore. It's going to the dominant key. Again, I'm using terms that are not correct because it's not a modulation to a dominant key, but that's the sense that it gives to a modern listener. Of course, the music then keeps going on with B flats all over the place. So it's just a temporary. It's just one note that is different, but it's interesting to see that it's been used here at the end of the tenor's melisma on desiderat. So it's almost like it's reaching somewhere else for this inner desire that it has. one more interesting thing about this section is how the syllable C of desiderat is always suspended and then made into a melisma. It's interesting because this suspension really gives you the sense of something that is missing, something that is trying to go somewhere, and it gives a sense of anxiety in a certain sense to the music. So all of this, if you notice, the syllable C, apart from the tenor entries that do not have melismas, the syllable C always has a dotted note or a note that is tied over, and above a beat, above a strong beat. So that really gives this sense of desire, of search that Palestrina was looking after here. Now this next section, where we're singing Anima Mea, so we're thinking about the spirit that is searching for God. This section is interesting from let's say orchestration point of view. It's not an orchestra, obviously, but a choral orchestration point of view, because as performed in a modern choir, the entries of each voice are going to be on a pretty high note for that voice, and that's going to give that's going to give each entry an emphasis, and almost like lighthouses in the dark, they're going to come out of the midst of the choir, of the counterpoint, and they're just going to light up the sound. On bar 40 we have the sopranos coming in, and then on bar 41 the altos. They're both on notes that are relatively high for their their voice. So if performed a third above, the sopranos a major third above, or just a third above. If it's a major third above, it's going to be a D, and the soprano and the altos are going to be on an A. So they're both notes that are pretty high up in their register, and they're really going to stand out with respect to the rest of the choir. The tenors come in 2 bars later here with a D again, and then finally the basses come in after a pretty long rest. So they're also going to stand out because the lack of a bass. Basses come out quite well in choirs, because when a low note is missing, you can really hear that, and the entry of the bass is going to be emphasized by the fact that there was pauses before. So you're going to really hear that Anima Mea by the basses. This is wonderfully orchestrated, chorally orchestrated, because not only are the entries going to come out from the rest of the choir because of the high register they're written in, they're also going to come out because it starts with a suspension, a tied note. They're also going to come out because the rest of the choir is ending their phrase, their melisma. So maybe the tenors are going to bother you a little bit there because they have ascending notes, a little scale that goes up with dotted notes there on bar 41. But not really, because in that phrase the tenors don't have that much breath left, and it's not going to be really loud. So the sopranos are going to have all the room to stand out with this new melody. This is the new melody. The spirit is really floating above the rest of the choir. So here we're talking about the spirit, and the suspension is not a suspension of anxiety like before. It's a suspension that gives a sense of floating. The spirit, that's what it does. It floats. So these notes are floating up above the rest. The melody is made out of mostly long notes, because of this sense that Palestrina is trying to depict and manages wonderfully. Another wonderful element of this, from a contrapuntal point of view, harmonic, let's say a choral point of view, the entries have a certain order in their appearance. So there's sopranos, then the altos, then the tenors, and then the basses. And looking at the score is great, because every phrase that comes before ends exactly when the next one is going to start. So basically, when the sopranos start, the tenors and the basses are still singing desiderat. And then the tenors stop and start singing anima, and then the basses stop and they start singing anima. So it's really quite symmetrical here. I mean, they're not. It's not mathematically symmetrical. It's kind of like the start when the main theme comes in. The measures are not exactly the same, the beats of pause and so on. But at the end, it's a technique of having these entries come from above and then going down the voices is really effective. And then the other melody is on Ad te Deus, so to you, God, and these words are enunciated in a more perentory kind of way, but still, from time to time, there's voices that keep coming out of the midst, singing Anima Mea, and that's really what characterizes this last part. There's kind of like when you go into a place where there's people talking, whispering, like a church, and then there's one voice that comes out singing above all the others, and you can hear it. But there's still this, chit chatter beneath. That's kind of how I see this part. There's the chit chat, which is all of the words, all the voices singing Ad te Deus on a register that is pretty normal. And then all of the other voices. I mean, from time to time, each voice has their turn in saying Anima Mea, and really, it's placed at a pitch. For example, in bar 46 and 47, the altos come out singing Anima Mea. And then 2 bars later, so bar 49, there's the sopranos that come out singing Anima Mea, while below something else is going on. And then it's the turn of the tenors and the basses and the tenors. The basses are going to be heard because they have that big, octave leap. And they're strangely, that's the only time Anima Mea is sung with a different entry, like a different notes. So it's fa, do, sol instead of a descending notes. So that's interesting, but it really works out really well because it almost gives like a jump to the music for it to not yet end, because here you can tell the music is coming to an end, but and there's a cadence, but this cadence doesn't feel like the end. It feels like the basses are jumping up and down with these big intervals, and the music just keeps going. And at the end, there's a wonderfully constructed piece of counterpoint here with Ad te Deus, sopranos, tenors, altos, basses, then the altos again, and then the tenors again, while the sopranos keep this really long F at the end, and it's like a upper pedal note that gives the chance to the other voices to come to a halt here and finally finish on this F major chord. So basically, I talked a little bit about my impressions on this piece. I've sung it a lot of times, and I sing tenor, and I perhaps talked a bit too much about the tenor line. I know it's not a perfect analysis. It's not. I didn't talk much about the harmony. But I think I talked about some things that are interesting to me, and that I talked about what I think was Palestrina's intention from an expressive point of view. Today this piece was written as a processional, so it's thought of to be performed for liturgical purposes, for services. So today we have a conception. This music came to us, and we have a more artistic conception of these works. So perhaps at the time they were just used for the service, and there wasn't a really big aesthetic response to these pieces. And now that we've discovered how much research from an expressive point of view there is, and from a technical point of view there is in these pieces. In the composition of these pieces, I think we appreciate them maybe even further, and we want to be careful in performing them, so that they are, you know, correctly, artistically portrayed. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please like it. I think I'm going to go ahead and put out a challenge. If I reach 50 likes, I'm going to make another video. Please comment below and tell me which masterpiece of choral repertoire you'd like me to analyze, and I'll be glad to do one of them, one of those that are posted below in the comments. Thank you, and have a nice day.